And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by BUSA Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025. Good evening. Welcome to the program tonight. It's been a sort of tumultuous weekend, and I suspect when you look at who's in the White House at the moment, you were not surprised this morning to see that the US President Donald Trump pretty much dominated the news from a business point of view, really about US steel tariffs that are now being imposed on all steel that are going into the United States. 25%, he says. He, of course, I thought this was intriguing, made this announcement while on a certain plane that the Americans call Air Force One. We have our own Air Force One. While he was on his way to an American football match. That's had a huge impact. But in a strange way, what's been really interesting to me is about his comments about South Africa and the impact that they've had. And the vast majority of South Africans seem almost united in their opposition to Trump. I say the vast majority. I realize that that's not everybody, and some of the not everybody have very much been in touch with me for various reasons over the last few days. But on the one side, and this really tickled me a little bit, on the one side, you have the person in the White House making threats against South Africa, saying we're supporting bad actors, saying no more foreign aid, kind of full stop. This would presumably threaten our continued status in AGOA, for example. The JSE today up 0.3%, approaching record highs. I mean, it's astonishing. And this is really, I suppose, because of the gold price. So on the one side, you've got tariffs, you've got Trump's threats. Then as a result of tariffs and general sort of concerns about risk, the gold price goes up. And as a result of that, one of the reasons, I suppose, pushing the JSE up, the Rand up quite strongly too, doing quite nicely. We'll talk a little bit more about the Rand in about 20 minutes' time or so, because there's a lot to say around it. My question for you tonight, I suppose, is whether in the face of what Trump is saying, should government make concessions? Should we remove ourselves from the case around Gaza and Israel, for example, that we started at the International Court of Justice? So here, I suppose, are two ways to feel about such an action. The one, very strongly, would be to say we've sold out on a point of principle for simple money. We've been bullied by someone who's richer than us, and we're accepting that, and we're now selling out, and we're going to get the money, and we're going to drop these things. The other way would be to say it is entirely rational to drop what is an important principled stance if we need to make sure that first and foremost South African incomes are protected. I can see that. I can see a politician making that argument too. Where do you fall on that spectrum? 011 8830 702 021 446 0567, and of course voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702. I got into the habit at one point in my life in saying the job I didn't want was to be the CEO of Eskom. I think to be the Minister of International Relations at the moment may be the job I don't want tonight.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, we start tonight, of course, with that announcement from the US President Donald Trump that he will impose tariffs on all steel entering the US. Already shares of European and Asian steel makers sliding on the day. Shares in US steel makers rising, obviously. The EU also suggesting it would impose tariffs in retaliation if the US imposes these tariffs. Donald MacKay is a director at XA International Trade Advisors. Donald, good evening to you. I mean, in an important way, the story is about steel tariffs, but it's also, I suppose, about the confirmation that Trump is going to try and impose tariffs on entire sectors. It's proof he's determined to use tariffs come what may.
Yeah, it certainly appears that way. It's of course not only steel; it's aluminium as well, which he's thrown a threat in, and he has threatened reciprocal tariffs, which I think means he'll impose the same duties as his counterparties do on any given product. So an awful lot happened last night.
The EU is speaking of retaliation. I mean, I presume they would have to do something that sends a strong message. Do they have a lot of options?
I mean, this really is a lose-lose game. You can't have one country simply countering another, followed by another, and so on. We're all just getting poorer in this process. So I'm hoping at some point the retaliation can stop and we can sit down and have a sensible conversation. But I fear that the President of the United States may prove to be quite difficult to reason with. So I can understand the threats of retaliation, but we must remember that should you do that, Europe is then imposing duties on their taxes, I should say, on their own citizens. So there's a cost to doing this. It's not, as Trump says, without cost, and nor are these duties paid by the exporters. So the consequences are real if we end up in a trade war. Of course, we seem to be in one.
I mean, it's one thing and in a way understandable from a geopolitical point of view for the United States and China to be in a trade war. We understand there's sort of, to use a phrase, great power rivals, okay? But the US and the EU have worked together for decades. Arguably, Western Europe is a product of the United States after World War II. It's almost fashioned part of it in its own image if you look at the Marshall Plan, for example. I mean, they're supposed to be aligned with each other. This would be a major shift.
Yeah, I wrote a few months ago that how Trump treats his allies is more important to watch than how he treats his enemies, if we can call China that. So absolutely, it's disrupting, of course, not only just trade, but it's disrupting the whole security infrastructure within Europe. It threatens things like NATO, with all kinds of consequences that I'm not sure any of us entirely understand properly, including the president, I might add.
Donald MacKay, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Director at XA International Trade Advisors. You can imagine how busy Donald is tonight. Well, while Trump was talking about steel tariffs over the weekend, also issuing an executive order to stop all foreign aid to South Africa, suggesting our government is helping, I think the phrase was, bad actors, people who wish to harm the United States. We shouldn't forget part of this might well be our case against Israel over its conduct in Gaza at the International Court of Justice. Khulekani Mathe is the CEO at Business Unity SA. Khulekani, good evening to you. The US, our second biggest trading partner. When we have these comments from the White House, how worried are you about our trading relationship?
Good evening, Stephen, and to the listeners. We obviously are worried, anything that threatens our trade relations with the U.S. Is cause for concern for the impact that it would have on South Africa, but also because they are, in addition to trade, there are investment relations where South African companies are invested in the U.S. Not too many, but there are still, and as many as 600 or thereabout American companies that are invested in South Africa. And so good bilateral relations between the two countries is absolutely critical.
If tariffs were imposed, I mean, even sanctions, I can't see that for the moment, but could all be pretty devastating to some of our businesses, but also devastating to American businesses. Their investments here would be at risk, as you remind us.
Yeah, no, it would be devastating for everybody concerned. But look, I am hoping that the announcement by our president that he will be sending envoys to various capitals of the world to explain our position, that it may very well do the trick in preventing the worst. So hopefully, we get to a point where cool heads prevail and that we engage each other and find each other rather than the kind of reactions that we've seen so far, which are very vindictive and punishing South Africa in some instances for really, not so accurate information as it relates to the Expropriation Act, for instance, and what it is assumed to be.
I want to be optimistic. I'm sorry to say this, but I'm not convinced that sending people to Washington to talk to Trump is actually going to make much of a difference, or to talk to the people around him. I mean, Khulekani, I don't know if you're volunteering, but I think that's going to be a very tough job.
It will be a very tough job indeed, but we've had many people characterize President Trump, and these are people who either know him or at least have been studying him for some time, saying that he's a very transactional person. And so hopefully if there is a discussion in which he is convinced about what is put before him and so on, he would be persuaded differently. So I don't believe that President Trump plans to run his presidency for the next 4 years, like we've seen in the past couple of weeks of him in office. So clearly at some point there would have to be a change. This is not going to be a way of running an administration, and obviously then engagement will prevent, or at least make sure that when he settles down, where he settles is based on a better understanding of where South Africa is, a better understanding of the context in which South Africa has acted.
Khulekani, should South Africa be making concessions on bigger policy issues just to keep these trading relationships open? Should we change our stance to Gaza and Israel? Should we be looking at other things, our relationship with Iran, which Trump is complaining about? I mean, should we make concessions on things like that to please the world's biggest economy?
These are the kinds of issues for which we have elected a government to really deal with, because this is politics with a capital P. We are certainly looking at what economic impact the actions by the U.S. will have, and as we said, the impact would be devastating. But we don't necessarily suggest that South Africa needs to act simply to appease a powerful nation. We just think that an engagement might help us to avert the worst.
All right. No, I mean, I understand your point, and obviously talking is always a good thing, particularly in situations like this. Either way, the lack of clarity must be affecting investment decisions, both by Americans into South Africa and by some of our companies. No one's going to want to make big decisions at a time like this.
Indeed. And this is why you would have seen many business organizations, ourselves and others in the agri sector, etc., really coming out to explain what the business position is in relation to the Expropriation Act, because we want to make sure that our counterparts in the U.S. and investors understand how we see things as business people, and they don't rely on one source for their information. And hopefully that gives them a different perspective to what is going on in South Africa.
Khulekani, there's so many different things that are happening, and nobody really knows what is going to actually happen. But I would imagine that, you know, as a lobby group, as someone who represents organized business, this could be one of the bigger threats that we face. I mean, just a few months ago, the conversation was, you know, about AGOA. Now it's about tariffs. It could possibly be infinitely worse in some ways.
Indeed, it is. I think the global economy is going through a difficult time. I mean, your conversation with Donald just before me is really just demonstrates exactly that. And hopefully, though, as I've said, things do settle down at some point, and that we do not have this for the next 4 years of the Trump administration.
Khulekani Mathe, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate the time. CEO at Business Unity South Africa on The Money Show. So much more to say about Trump, about tariffs. I suspect, though, that we are going to have many more opportunities to say them, simply because I think a lot more is going to come from the White House over the next few days. 22 after 6.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Well, Peter Brook is portfolio manager at the Old Mutual Investment Group. Peter, good evening to you. A really strong update from Telkom. I mean, sort of growing their share of the market very nicely, seem to be outperforming some of their competitors, and obviously the market loving it.
That's right. So star of the day, if you look at its share price performance, up nearly 8%. And that's driven by that Q3 trading statement. The interesting thing is, revenue was largely flat. It was at the EBITDA line, or the earnings before interest and tax, where things really jumped. They grew by 28% there. So some of that's question a bit of property sales in there, which is a little bit dodgy, but what they've really done is they've managed their costs better. And I think something else that stands out to me is they're taking market share in mobile. And in data, they've added 100,000 homes over the last period.
I mean, it does seem that they're well positioned, and that's obviously one of the reasons the share price went up. But, I mean, it's an astonishing story from a company that at one point was owned by the state.
Well, actually, it does this through periods. If you remember back when Sipho Mateko took over, he drove a phenomenal recovery, and they did rather well. Personally, I mean, I've had two experiences with them recently. One was hell, trying to cancel a service. So I just went to one of their little kiosks, and the guy did it in 2 minutes. Couldn't be happier, couldn't be nicer. It's a really great service there. And then our tree fellas managed to cut through the fiber cable, and they came around on the weekend and fixed it. So generally, not bad.
Sure. A couple of director appointments today, Capitec and British American Tobacco. Interesting to see who they appointed.
Yeah, I think we often forget how important directors can be in terms of setting the tone and how well a company does. And Capitec has been a long-term winner in terms of driving their business. And I just thought they made a really smart appointment. So they added a new non-executive director who used to be the head of global enterprise growth for MasterCard. So globally successful business, highly competent guy, and smart to bring in global skills. So I think too often in South Africa, we sort of paint by the numbers and sort of pick a local person, slightly overboarded. This is now bringing in some fresh talent to help you move to the next level. And we saw a similar sort of thing in terms of British American Tobacco, where they brought in the ex-CEO of Merck and Procter & Gamble's consumer healthcare businesses. And this really sort of reinforces the move that British American Tobacco is a consumer goods play and the shift away from tobacco into other areas.
Very interesting to sort of get an indication of the direction that both of these companies are moving in. I have a question for you about the Rand, Peter. I mean, for all of the talk coming out of the Trump White House around South Africa, and there's been quite a lot of it, and I suspect for various reasons there'll be a lot more to come, but the Rand's been incredibly resilient. 1840 the last time I checked. Yes, it went through 19 early last week, but since then, it's just sort of steadily done very nicely.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I was actually away on holiday last week. So sort of the announcement came out and I was like, oh, is my holiday going to be a bit more expensive? And so I looked very closely at everything over this last period. And so obviously today it was strong. It was actually the best performing currency in the world. But if you look at the other other countries with it, Australian dollar, Argentinian peso, Norwegian krona, those are all resource currencies. And then if we take a slightly longer term view, which is what I obviously prefer to do, over the last month, you can see the same pattern. It's the Chilean peso, the Colombian peso, the Brazilian real. So very much commodity currencies. And that sort of leads us to the answer, which over the last month, copper's up 9, iron ore's up 9, and then obviously a key one for us is gold is up 8%, hitting a record high. And we are still important in terms of that market. And then on the other side of the coin, we've actually got the crude oil price down 6. So our terms of trade have improved. And that's what it's all about. It's about the fundamentals rather than the noise and the politics.
And just a reminder of how important gold still is to us. I mean, obviously, record highs for gold, and that's also pushed up some of the resource shares on the JSE. But gold still matters to South Africa.
Yes, it does. But it's actually, I wouldn't lose sight of that copper and iron ore. So there's a little bit of noise happening in that industrial complex, if you think about it. And one of the things that surprises me is that China is actually outperforming global equities year to date. So a little bit of resilience in property prices. So if we actually have that starting to come through, that is a much more important driver than US aid.
Peter Brook, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate the time. Portfolio Manager at the Old Mutual Investment Group.
The Money Show.
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
And DSTV channel 856.
19 minutes to 7. I don't know if you have a view on this or not, but if you're the South African government, do you make a concession to basically keep the US economy and its president, Donald Trump, on side? Do you say, actually, we are going to change this policy, but we're not going to change that? Or do you actually take a much harder line and say, look, you're bullying us and we know there'll be a financial penalty for this, but we're going to stand up to you anyway? It's a bit like, you're in the playground, you see a bully doing something, or the bully comes up to you and you essentially say to the bully who pushes you, you push them back. And you kind of know what's coming. You know, you're going to get the punch to the jaw. You know it's going to hurt. And maybe when you go to bed that night, you'll remember that. Maybe you'll remember standing up for yourself. I mean, the president very clearly last week during a State of the Nation address saying that we will not be bullied. I think correct to say that. If you don't start off like that, at the very least, you're in deep trouble with any kind of bully. Do we change any of the points of principle on which our government and to an extent our nation stands? 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. Good to hear voice notes from you this evening as well on 072 702 1702.
702. Stephen is on the Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
A lot of chatter about the NHI again over the last few days. First, the ANC and the DA said there'd been some kind of, I suppose I should really call it truce over the NHI, which would see a ministerial advisory committee of some kind being set up. Then both parties confirmed that the new system would allow medical aids to continue. But the Health Minister, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, then said he doesn't know anything about the deal. And as far as the NHI Act is concerned, he pointed out there doesn't appear to be space for medical aids. The Nation Naidu is the CEO of the Health Funders Association. The Nation, good evening. Thanks for your time. I mean, from what you know, what is the state of play? Is there now suddenly, again, room for medical aids under the NHI?
Sure, thanks, and good evening to your listeners. So, thanks, Stephen. I think we actually a little bit in the dark. What we hear about and read about is, in the newspapers, and there's tremendous amount of speculation. So it's difficult for us to comment one way or the other. What I can say, which is in front of us, is the NHI Act is brought into law. It's the definitive measure by which we have to follow. And, that's currently on play. So it brings major changes. And until such time, either that's changed by Parliament or by a court of law, it still remains a law. And we're not clear on what the Ministerial Advisory Committee will do or don't. We're not aware of the terms of reference or who's part of it yet.
Okay, so unless the law is changed, there's no space for medical aid.
Yeah. Fundamentally, I think the law is quite clear in terms of Section 33. It states that once NHI is implemented, medical schemes will only offer complementary cover or top-up cover. But the concern there really is there's no clear timeline. We don't know yet what the NHI benefits package will include. And for that matter, then what will schemes actually be allowed to cover on top of that? So for us, we view that there is no current existence of medical schemes in the way we know it today.
Sure. You're obviously going to court on this. Many organizations going to court on this. Are you confident that these cases will stop the NHI, or let me be clear, the NHI Act in its current form?
So we can never be certain, in the ways when we go to court. And I think this is why we have a judicial system. I think going to litigation will actually set a better act, potentially set aside. But in the end, we believe, the proper justice will be served. We hope, that our side of the in terms of how we view NHI and what we propose in many others will show its light and hopefully set aside Section 33.
The Nation, I'm sure you know this. There are plenty of people who hate their medical aids. They don't think they're getting value for money from their medical aids. I suspect that one of the reasons that the NHI has gone as far as it has is because people feel that they're kind of being ripped off. And whether they are or not is a different case. They feel it's something they have to have. How do you respond to that? It's quite an intriguing point in this argument. And I think it's a strong argument coming from people who propose an NHI, that for a lot of people, a medical aid feels like a rip-off.
Sure, and I must say, when I was in my teenage years and just started off working, I also kind of felt like it was a grudge purchase. Why? I'm young, healthy. If I get knocked by a car, I'm going to be fine. We kind of had a sense of immortality. But, that's exactly what NHI, that's exactly what medical schemes are there for. They are actually there as risk insurance, so that when you actually get injured, you don't have to worry about the cover you require because we pay for it. Now, I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of myths and misinformation. Now, just to give an idea, there's a huge number of saying there's a huge amount of out-of-pockets, but I can tell you across the globe, our out-of-pocket payments in South Africa is about 5.5% of expenditure. It's one of the lowest across the globe. in terms of out-of-pockets. And partly because, we're based on the solidarity principle. We have a package, we cover for PMBs, etc. Unfortunately, why we've got escalations in the years and increase in contributions is partly due to incomplete regulatory framework from 20 years ago. So that compounded with some other effects has resulted in medical schemes increasing costs, well in advance of salary inflation.
I can just see people arguing with euthanasia, but I hear you. I realize they're not for profit, but there's big building in Santon people point to, the one, things like that. People just get a sense that actually it's not working out for them. There's a lot of politics to this. My own sense of the politics is that both the DA and the ANC quite like the NHI issue. So they're actually very happy to keep it in court for a while. It's good for both their voters. It gives them something to argue about. The problem for your industry is that there's no clarity for quite a long time.
Yes. I think fundamentally, and that's our biggest concern, I think it was previously raised, there's two roads. There's the high road and the low road. The high road is, work with the private sector, because the private sector, besides supporting universal health coverage, has all the skills, the knowledge regarding, healthcare insurance. We have the expertise, having done so, but unfortunately, we're going the low road, which means all the route to universal healthcare coverage in the way the Act is defined is probably going to take us 5 to 10 years, because we're going to be spending tons of money and effort through the court systems trying to find who is right, in terms of this. And unfortunately, we could have been using this time progressively to figure out what are the constructive ways to enable this in a more sustainable and financially viable way.
Thanation Naidu, thanks very much indeed, CEO of the Health Funders Association. Do appreciate it. I'd like to hear from you tonight how you feel about your medical aid. I realize not everybody feels ripped off, but I think many people do. One of the problems with medical aid is that it is very difficult to understand. It's almost as bad as a cell phone contract. You start to read the fine print and you actually need to sit down for quite a long time just to recover. And I realize that medical insurance is, just by the nature of it, a complex and technical thing. I suppose in some ways there will be people, and I recently bumped into someone who said something had happened to their partner, do very bad things in succession, and it virtually cost them nothing. You hear from other people who just feel they've been throwing money down the drain. Your view, 011 883 0702 021 446 0567.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by ABSA Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025.
9 minutes now to 7 the time. Good to hear from you on medical aids this evening. If you've been listening to this show for 5 minutes or even 30 seconds, you'll know there's really a growing and deeper level of risk at the moment. And working out how to make your money and how to invest it is becoming more difficult. Within all of this is, I think, a major problem about governments and trust. And in fact, it seems to me, I imagine to you too, there's a distinct lack of trust around at the moment. Sandile Khulekani, the partner at EY in the Africa government and infrastructure industry leader, has been compiling a list of some of the most serious risks facing corporates, trying to basically, trying to assess it, but is also very concerned about the lack of trust. Sandile, good evening to you. Your list includes unsustainable public finances, weak economic growth, growing work informality. It would seem both the level of risk and the number of risks are growing at the moment.
Yes, good evening, Stephen, and thank you for having me on your show. A slight correction there. So these 10 risks we've analyzed, we believe are risks that governments globally should start to apply in the same way that the private sector looks at mitigating risks. So this is our point of view on some of the top 10 emerging risks globally that all governments, including South African governments, need to think about how to address them. And we've highlighted some of those risks and some of the mitigations that governments could apply to better help mitigate country risk, which by definition translates into corporate risk as well. So there is a correlation to corporate risks as well.
A big problem is trust. Could governments use this moment in a strange way to build trust? And I fear that this is, if you did polling around the world, you'll probably find that trust in government has really sort of, decreased quite significantly in the last few years.
Yeah. And I think if you look at it's the overhang of the COVID pandemic impact. Most economies have not recovered from that period in terms of level of production, level of security, level of unemployment have stayed at that level. So it is this slow recovery of global economies beyond that. And then also you have seen with a lot of the recent geopolitical tensions and elections, the advent of this sort of a right-wing position, the type parties coming into play that have got a much more of a centralist state-focused agenda versus some of the center or left-leaning approaches of being inclusive and global. That then puts a lot more tension then to then figure out the counterparty country I'm dealing with, where they're currently facing. And naturally, a lot of these parties are elected by their population. So the first reaction is, how do I solve employment and bring down costs for my own country by looking internally? That's one way of looking at things versus the whole global integrated economy that we've been living in over the last few decades. But the reality is no country is an island, Stephen. So at some point, we all need to interact, and hence why we are putting forward these 10 risks that governments need to think about and how to address more consistently in a way that helps other countries navigate engagement with us, and two, for corporates to also understand how we do respond to that.
I mean, so much of it is simply about economics, and it's just a reminder of what governance is like when the economy is growing and what governance is like when it's not. And that's really a major issue in most places, that the economy is not growing. And I think there's also division on how to make economies grow.
Correct. So of the top 10 risks, I mean, there's about 5, and we've graded these risks, between high, medium, and low. The highest risk, which is number one by all, is the inability to achieve sustainable public finances for governments and for countries to grow. And that's the big one with the biggest, highest impact in terms of thinking how to navigate and actually mitigate that particular risk. Because if you think about it, governments are the ones that drive economic growth agendas. They, receive sort of funding to the fiscus, and then they decide how best to apply that. So really having a clear view around what do I do to mitigate achieving my financial sustainability type goals from the perspective becomes quite important. And here you need to look at determining long-term value public money-based outcomes. So looking more at impact outcomes than actually how much money you're going to spend from that particular perspective.
I mean, one of the points you make is around the low resilience of employees. So people in the public sector will find actually that they find it very difficult to do their jobs. There's an overwhelming workload. You speak to probably any nurse and any nurse or any doctor in any government hospital, and you can just imagine their position. This is something governments need to take quite seriously. The people they employ are not always able, through no fault of their own, to do the jobs that they're supposed to do.
It's the whole advent of trying to do more with less. So that's why a lot of human capital resources within government, even private sector, feel stretched right now, because we are trying to achieve a lot more outcomes, much more quicker, much bigger with a lot of capability. And this is where we look to say, governments need to start adopting technology to reduce the administrative burden of employees in terms of getting data, making information to make informed decision. Also looking at adopting some of the private sector models of looking at social rewards rather than just pure salary to compensate those employees, to give them, a more meaningful sense of purpose, but more importantly, talent development within the public sector. That's one thing private sector knows well. Continuously having skill development and training and upskilling your staff is important from that perspective, because realistically, the nature of jobs today in both public and private sector are not the same as they were a decade ago.
And then sort of rebuilding trust. I mean, governments would have to be, I suppose, a lot more transparent would be one way to do it. You need to actually spend more time with communities and know what they need.
And that's important. So going back to the basics of stakeholder engagement and stratifying your stakeholders and engaging with each one very appropriately, and understanding whatever new legislation I'm about to put out or strategy, how will it impact particular stakeholders, and conversing with them so that there are no surprises. I mean, the biggest thing that impacts any economy or country is a surprise on a legislative level, on a strategic level. So this is where communication can begin to help to rebuild trust, but also, being very recognizing that within our own country, we've actually put together a government of national unity, which means we've actually mixed a lot of parties from the far left to the right to try and come up and say you're more of a centrist type party. But if we're still looking at strategies that actually drive, more far left type programs, you are going to have tensions. So it's about identifying who are the stakeholders that would be impacted by the decision or change I'm making, communicate to them. And as South Africa, we've got a great history of being able to converse and talk ourselves and find each other. We brought about, a political dispensation through CODESA and conversations. We need to find our way back to engaging each other as stakeholders and not seeing each other as adversaries.
Thank you very much indeed, Sandile Khlope. Really appreciate the time. EY partner and Africa Government and Infrastructure Industry leader. There's a lot to talk about in terms of governance during this particular time.
WhatsApp Stephen
On 072
702
1702.
Don't forget, My Money from 7:30. We'll be speaking to the actress Shannon Ezra. I suppose I should call her Lioness. You might well know her from that. She was on billboards everywhere about it, but looking forward to her conversation in a little while. We'll talk also about a book called Two Thoughts, a timeless collection of infinite wisdom. Can anything really be timeless? Can wisdom really be infinite? And if it was, would you be listening to The Money Show? Really? Or would you just be listening to an old one because it's timeless? With that, it's 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show.
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by BUSA Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025. Good evening. Don't forget, we'll be speaking to the lioness herself, Shannon Ezra, in a little while, someone who's had a long journey in the acting profession. Also, Bronwyn Williams, the trend translator and future finance specialist at Flux Trends. She's looking at a book. It's called Two Thoughts, a timeless collection of infinite wisdom. I know Bronwyn a little bit. I'm not convinced she thinks any wisdom is timeless, but we'll hear from her in just a little while as well. And then also from the JSE in a moment, 4.5 billion rand is unclaimed. Could it be you who's owed that money in a strange way? Good to hear from you tonight as well on 011 8830702 and 02144605667.
WhatsApp Stephen
On 072
702.
1702.
Voice notes coming in this evening.
Hi there, Stephen. If the president is serious about convincing the rest of the world, especially the United States, that what South African government is up to is contrary to what the Americans believe it is, then send a team of businessmen with credibility, not politicians with no credibility. That's our only hope. Cheers, Peter.
Peter, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I suppose you should send a golfer too to go with the business people. And Gary Player says he's a friend of Donald Trump and he's someone who plays with him regularly, but I don't know how much use that would be at this point. But yes, I hear your point. I do think that Trump speaks the language of business in some ways. On the other hand, of course, politicians are elected. Other voice notes this evening.
Hi, Stephen. I just thought I'd comment on Drickus du Plessis wearing that Trump T-shirt. I think Drickus knows exactly where his bread is buttered. And Dana White, who owns the UFC, is a major funder and supporter, along with Joe Rogan, for the Republicans. That's Trump. So I don't think really he just chose a T-shirt off his top shelf. He was given that T-shirt just strategically, and for doing that, he's just supporting where his money comes from.
Yeah, no, I have no reason to argue with you at all. I mean, if you think about it, UFC is a massive, massive business, and you want to be involved in that. If you're Drickus, and obviously he's exceptionally good at it, world class, world beating, and so that's what he's going to go and do. There is a whole kind of world around it, not a world I've spent any time in, I must say, and that world, like it or not, is very much a Trump world. So I'm not entirely surprised to sort of find out that Drickus is doing that. If I were him, if I were in that world, maybe I'd sort of be doing it too. It does tell you something about the sort of information ecosystem about sport and about politics in the United States at the moment. And I say that on the day after Trump became one of the first U.S. presidents in a very long time to actually go to a Super Bowl, which is really their... I sort of say the Curry Cup, but really a kind of World Cup, if you like, of American football. I say that because only one nation plays it. But do you see the point that I'm making? I mean, there's a lot to sort of look at there around sport and politics.
702 with Stephen Grootes.
Email him on stephen@702.co.za.
A statement from the JSE today saying they're actually looking for what I presume is quite a large group of people who may be able to claim up to around 4.5 billion rand, not each collectively, in dividends from particular stocks. Vuyo Lee is the Director of Marketing and Corporate Affairs at the JSE. Vuyo, good evening. Why are these people owed this money? What led to this situation?
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me on board. I call it for reasons. BEAD as an acronym. The first one, B, is for banking details. So some of the shareholders have changed their banking details and haven't advised the issuers or the companies they hold shares with. So what tends to happen then is their dividends get paid into that account, it bounces back. The E is education. Some people don't understand how dividends work. When do they get paid? How do they find out a company actually pays dividends? And what we also found, Stephen, is that they've forgotten. They got shares from a BE scheme at work, or they were policy holders of an insurance company, or their parents bought them shares when the BE schemes were coming out in the early 2000s, and merely have just forgotten about it or forgotten they've purchased shares. Then there's A, which is change of address. So you change your address, and when the dividends bounce off your banking details that are now outdated, there's no way to find you. We don't have any contact details, and we don't know how to find you. And then last but not least, D, which is like it affects about 20% of the book, and that is deceased estates, where you find that somebody has passed away. They haven't written in their will that they've got shares, or indicated who the shares should go to, and then when the person passes away, those dividends remain unclaimed. And why we are actually embarking on this campaign is really to deal with all of these four reasons why dividends remain unclaimed. It's 4.5 billion in South Africa, probably close to 5 billion now. It's a huge amount of money which could make a profound impact in people's lives.
Where is that money now, Vuyo?
The money is currently sitting in the accounts of the issuers, in the shareholder accounts. They cannot put it in their balance sheet, so to speak. It will sit as a liability. And as soon as somebody claims, they will be able to receive that money. Some companies have got a timeline in the memorandum of incorporation where, for example, they would say that after 5 years, if the dividend remains unclaimed, it gets retained by the company. However, the issuers that are participating in our campaign have indicated that anybody who comes who is an outstanding dividend claimant will receive their dividends. Okay.
Is this just very specific companies that this situation involves? It doesn't involve all companies on the JSE. Some, as you say, are more likely than others, I suppose.
Some are more likely than others. Some of them have got a very small unclaimed dividends book, but it is quite common across companies for the reasons I've given in terms of banking details and the likes. When you change your details and you don't tell the issuer that you have changed any aspects in terms of where you live, your contact details or your banking details, then the situation will arise more than others. But we found some companies have as few as 1,000 shareholders with unclaimed dividends, and then some companies has as much as 100,000 of those, depending on the size of the company.
How long did it take this 4.5 billion rand to sort of build up? Most people, we forget what we owe, but we usually remember who owes us.
Did we surprise, Stephen? Some of for example, our company, JSE Investor Services, they do this kind of tracing. And what they find is that some of the claimants go as far back as 15 years, because of the BE schemes as well as other reasons where you just can't locate. There are some shareholders who are just impossible to find. And what we've done is we've gone into a partnership with a bureau that has advanced technology in terms of finding people. So currently, we've got a shareholder base of 375,000 people, and we've currently matched 86% of them to an address or an ID number. So we believe that with this campaign, we'll be able to find more people who come forward to us and find and check whether they've got unclaimed dividends. But it does go as far back as 15 years and 10 years. And, it doesn't matter whether you are a savvy investor or you are a novice investor. Some people just forget, which is quite surprising. They forget that these shares are in place, or they just don't know that these shares pay dividends. So they just assume, I've got the shares, but they never check what happened to the unclaimed dividend or the dividend that comes with that share.
No, sure. No, I can understand that. Okay. Is there a point at which you can no longer claim 20 years, 30 years, 50 years? I mean, you don't want this to be on your books as a company forever and ever.
It really depends on the company's policy. As I said, some companies have got a policy that says after 5-10 years, when the dividend becomes unclaimed, they can actually basically keep it and reinvest it in social initiatives and the likes. However, the companies that we are working with right now have basically said that this money belongs to the shareholder. We cannot use it for anything else, and we will hold it until such time that somebody comes forward.
And if someone passes away and there are no descendants, I suppose it just ends up being unclaimed. So it just ends up like that. Nothing else moves in for that.
It will remain unclaimed unless there is a executor who can give an instruction as to how that dividend becomes distributed. And this is the reason why it is important to have a will and updated documentation where you document all your assets and you also indicate where your financial assets, such as your will, such as your dividends, should go to, because that makes it easier. For example, when a person comes forward and say, a relative of mine have passed away, they had shares in the JSE, and there are dividends due. And we mustn't forget, with the dividends, there's also underlying shares. If we can go to the executor can tell you this is where these proceeds needs to go to. However, if you don't have a will, it then is a matter of the estate or even the cost to actually decide where those assets go to.
And okay, if you think it might be you, and it's 4.5 billion rand, Vuyo, so maybe it is. Where do you go? Do you start at your website?
We've got a website on jse.co.za. You can go into the portal that says Claim It. And on that portal, you put in your ID number, your name, surname, and your address, and you will receive instantly an email that will tell you whether or not you have unclaimed dividends with the 17 companies that we currently have on board. And these are very large companies like Sasol, Old Mutual, Cashbuild, Roynet, Yebo Yetu, and the like. So on the website, you'll be able to see which organization is participating in this campaign. For those who don't want to do it digitally, you can contact our call center number. It is 0861 401 105. I repeat, 0861 401 105. And then you can actually enter your details, and the call center agent will advise you. It is a very, very quick process, Stephen. I actually did it, and to my surprise, I got an email saying you've got unclaimed dividends.
Wow.
And that's to my point that, if you are a financially savvy person like I thought I was, it can actually happen that you've got unclaimed dividends. So it doesn't hurt to actually come and really check whether you've got these unclaimed dividends on jse.co.za, and you go on the Claim It page. The other thing, Stephen, that's important is the JSE and its issuers will never phone you to say you've got unclaimed dividends. We live in a landscape where there is a lot of fraud, there are a lot of impersonators, and part of the reason why we've made this an inbound campaign is precisely so that, people are not susceptible to fraudulent activities. So you will basically have to come to us, and then we've got a campaign where we'll be inviting people. Lucas Khadebe is our ambassador, and he will be telling people, look, just trust this and contact us, and we will let you know.
Vuyo Lee, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate the time. Director of Marketing and Corporate Affairs at the JSE. Fascinating to see how much money can be left unclaimed.
Stephen Grootes
Taking your calls
on 011-883-0702.
Don't forget, on the next Money Show, Warren Ingram, the personal finance expert, co-founder of Galileo Capital, he'll be looking at whether the stock market is a bubble or in a bubble that is ready to burst. Bubbles are scary for investors because they can severely damage your investments when the burst does happen. We'll also take a quick trip around the continent with our Africa business news expert, Victor Khumeswana. We'll also keep tabs on geopolitics and all the analysis of your top business stories of the day.
The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
We were due to speak to you about a book about infinite wisdom right now, and I'm just considering the irony of the fact that the phone line has taken this particular moment to not work for us. So I don't know if you have some infinite wisdom on medical aids or the US President Donald Trump that you would like to share with us on 011 883 0702 or 021 446 0567. I suppose one of the questions to ask yourself about Trump is how much longer this can all go on for. So week 1, yes, shock and all. Week 2, yes, shock and all. Week 3, shock, So I suppose the question I'm getting to is, yes, you can come in, and they call it in American politics flooding the zone. You just have a huge number of announcements all the time. No one can really get in your way. No one else can make any headway in the public narrative. The news media, the organizations don't know what to do. People pick and choose. I find this a very revealing moment for media organizations. You can tell quite a lot about them and who's making the decisions by the issues that they pick and choose when there are so many issues in the environment because of this sort of flood the zone strategy of the US president. What I'm really trying to say, though, is that you cannot do it forever. People get bored of you. And also, you can make as many promises as you like. If you don't follow through on all of them, in the end, you will be ignored. And the first people who will probably make that determination, actually, in one way or another, will be markets. And this is because people will have to sit down and consider every single threat that you make. And they'll have to consider every tariff that you then actually bring in. And they'll have to consider, does the tariff match the threat? Does the action match the threat? Does what you have done actually match what you have said you will do? And if it doesn't, over time, your comments just sort of stop setting the market alight one way or another. We're nowhere near that at this point. I mean, by a long chalk, if you think about it. There is a lot more to come, of course, on the Trump story. And the words that he says, the things that he says, still have a huge impact. Your thoughts on it this evening, voice notes on 072 702 1702.
Dumelan Salman and Stephen in your team. I think backing down would be the showing that we are weak. And we can't stand for what we understand. Trump and his country have got money and funds, but we need to stand for what we believe in, and we cannot be running around more controlled as if we are a small spaza shop owned by Trump. When he says something, we must shiver. And we'll survive. I believe South Africans are strong enough. We'll survive. I understand it looks bad now, but remember, what all that Trump is doing is not because of the Afrikaner issue that he has mentioned the other day. It's not all about that. It's about the support we give to people or to countries that he doesn't want us to give. So he's punishing the country for that. But we need to stand strong and stand firm in what we've been. We don't have to run because somebody's saying I'm taking funds. Then we run back to say, ish, we will not be having funds for that and that. We for now we can stay strong and make plans for what is needed.
Yeah, fair point. I mean, I do think that the idea of backing down would come very close and would feel a lot like selling out. And this is the problem. And I suppose also the job of professional politicians, our president is a professional politician, paid to do it for the moment. It is their job in a way to kind of be, I suppose the word would be adroit, to be able to move, to be agile, to move and to make sure that everybody kind of feels vaguely happy, or more accurately, can just afford to live with the outcome. And that's really one of the things that you would have to do if you were President Ramaphosa in this situation. You actually, in a way, have no choice. This is what you have to do. And the problem with this is that there's not a huge amount of space in which to move. And I think that really is the difficulty for a particular person. You know, you actually are in a position where you really do have to you have to manage yourself quite carefully, and that's what makes it really difficult to sort of do that, you know. You have to really do that. Well, taking calls tonight, Louise on the line from Northcliffe. You heard that conversation about the JSE and awaiting dividend payments. Hi.
Yes, Stephen. My situation is as follows. Many years back, I bought Sasol shares, and shares were still in certificate form.
Yes.
I then sold some of those, but they remained in odd lot. And I kept the share certificate without dematerializing it. And I'm also sitting with years of unexchanged dividend check payments that by the time they arrived in my post box, they were too old to be accepted by the bank.
Yes.
And subsequent to the dividend checks being stopped, obviously I've also not received that dividend. So that's how some investors end up in that position. But I'm sitting in front of me with a share certificate and all the unexchanged dividend checks.
Sure, Louise, there's got to be a procedure for it because, obviously there are deadlines to this, but it is your money.
Yeah, I tried the JSE Investor Services, but it seems like they're not picking up my ID number. So I'm thinking of actually going in directly to the JSE and taking the share certificate and all the unexchanged check dividend dividend checks that I have gathered over the years.
Look, I don't know if they'll be able to do anything to help you, but it sort of is up to them. So I would like to think that they can.
Yeah, it's worth a try.
It certainly is. Louise in Northcliffe, thank you. All right, interesting case. It does, and things do happen in life. This is one of the things about life, is that things happen. You never really know, what's going to happen. And it sounds, on the face of it, absurd that people can leave money just sort of lying around. And yet, actually, when you move house or something, if you never found something that belongs to you, how often have you sort of been, rifling through some clothes for some reason, or, putting something on you haven't had for a while and you find 100 Rand in your pocket? It's the same kind of equivalent, isn't it? Don't forget, we'll be speaking to Shannon Ezra in a moment about her money. She, of course, has been in the entertainment industry. I guarantee you've seen a billboard with her face on it. Looking forward to that in the next few moments. You're with The Money Show. It's 7:30.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app
and DSTV channel 856.
Time to find out a little bit more about the money journey of someone you know. Her name is Shannon Ezra. You need your memory jogged a little bit? All right then.
Baby, do you want to see some magic?
Get out of the car, you're under arrest.
What?
Put your head back and sit down.
Where are you taking her? We're gonna be okay. What happened to my life?
It's a night 6 feet underground.
I can get you the gun.
Take your children and you need to get out.
I've learned to fight for what is mine. And all three of them are mine.
Shannon Ezra, you may remember her as, not wearing a mane at the moment, but as sort of lioness. Shannon, thanks so much for coming in. Good evening.
Stephen, thank you very much for having me.
Awful lot of shouting in your line, it would seem.
It's called lioness for a reason. She roars.
Okay, we're going to talk about money for a little bit.
Okay.
Do you remember where you were, what you were doing when you first realized what money was? Was it you saw someone paying something for someone?
I remember vividly it is my father. My father taught me the value, my brother and I taught us the value of money very early on. So if we missed out on chores, or if we left dishes in the sink, or if we left lights on, my father's he's a man of great economy. And we were very, very privileged that we would get a monthly allowance. And my father, being an incredibly pragmatic, pedantic person, when the month would come for the pocket money to, be issued, in cash, because money was king back then, we would be docked for the ill-advised discrepancies, and it would be noted as to why. There would be a reason. You were docked X amount because this happened on this date. The efficacy with which this was done is an absolute.
Must have had a whole book.
You know what? If we had better computers back then, I think I would have been issued an Excel spreadsheet, and I say that so lovingly to my dad because it really is one of his favorite programs. I can't work it for love or money, but yeah. So we learned the value very, very, very early on.
It's quite a lesson that you are getting less than your brother or less than you should have because of something that happened 2 weeks ago.
He also made mistakes and he was punished for them.
What did you buy with the money that you got?
Gosh, you got to think back to when you were a teenager. I suppose CDs, music's always been something very important to me, but I was very lucky that I started making my own money from the time I was 15. And then that was, my father was putting that into investments and, they wanted to put it toward, my future.
Yeah.
Money's a very important thing in our household. So we have a great respect and fear around it.
It's interesting. There's been a generational shift in some ways. In many ways, if you were growing up in a suburb, let me call it that, in the 1980s and 1990s, to have a job from 15, 16, a lot of people did. Newspaper, waitering, all sorts of things. The law changed, but also what happened is that people who needed the job far more, waiter at a Spur, for example, was now feeding a family. No one was going to employ a teenager. I see this is slightly different in Cape Town, I suspect. But it was almost easier as a middle-class person to work as a teenager then, I think, than it is now. I think it's a bit harder now. It's very interesting to see how that's changed.
I can't say that I see a lot of teenagers as servers these days. No, and look, when I was waitressing, it was only when I was studying my drama degree. So in my first and second year, I worked at the Monte Casino. I worked at a little review bar called, which was great fun. And, they did drag shows. And I mean, it was a real good time, a lot of fun. And I made some really good money. But I was doing TV and I was doing, print commercials. So it wasn't that I was working every other weekend, but I must say my first real job, I worked in a gift shop. I wrapped presents and I was like the till girl, it'd be like, and that'll be $10.95 and so that was and that was because I wanted a sense of my own independence. I wanted to spend my money on the things that I wanted. Yeah.
There's a lot that comes with that. I mean, do you remember getting, I don't know if it was a paycheck, might have been money in a bank account. You'd have to go to an ATM to see if you'd been paid. I mean, can you imagine? Or
when United was a bank. It was
United.
It was what was it called? And it had a red and yellow.
Didn't have two hands underneath it, or was that something else?
No, it was something else. But I remember my mom opened the bank account for us, and we would put our money in there so it could be in a savings account. Did I get
your little savings book or something?
No, I wasn't definitely not paying that much attention to any of those things.
So you're moving along, and can you remember, because your career has started to take off at a relatively young age, you were studying, things were beginning to happen for you. Do you remember getting your first paycheck and what you wanted to do?
I just wanted to keep working. I actually wasn't really concerned about the money at all. I wanted it to be something that could be saved, almost like a nest egg, which I'm very, and I have throughout my career, I've been very fastidious and litigious about putting money away because there's so much downtime between jobs that you have to live off that saving, which is a very scary reality. But thank goodness that I have that that compulsion, because it does feel quite compulsive, to be honest.
Did it help that your father had done what he did?
Absolutely. I mean, my father, I'll tell you, there is a lot that my father has taught me about life. I mean, my mother as well, but, especially when it comes to money practices,
So, this is a strange question, I suppose, but I remember when I was first doing what I wanted to do, so working in radio, and getting my first paycheck from that, which was more than I'd earned doing other things. And I was really excited because I was being paid to do something that I would have done for free. Still would.
Say that softer.
Softly, it's the money show.
Yes.
So do you remember, did you ever have a feeling like that? Like you wanted to do acting, I presume. You studied acting. This is something you wanted to do. When did you get your first acting paycheck, I suppose is another way of asking the same question.
So the first acting paycheck came when I Dreamed of Africa with Kim Basinger when I was 16 years old.
Most people didn't start with Kim Basinger, just so you know.
No, or Daniel Craig, or Lance Reddick, the late Lance Reddick, or even Marie Saint, who's an Oscar winner. You know, she acted with Marlon Brando on the waterfront. I mean, it blew my mind. I could not have cared to have gotten paid for that job at all. I had the time of my life. I thought, this is all I ever want to do. This is where I want to live on set every day for the rest of my life. It was bliss. And it's the best.
Still. How did you get that gig at 16? I mean, obviously you had something that they were looking for.
So Krista Schamberger-Young, who's one of our top casting directors in South Africa, she came to my high school, which was Crawford College. Back then it was in Khulekani, in this little business campus.
It just started then.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, we were the first standard 6, see how old I am. We were the first standard 6 year that went through to the matric year. We had a formidable drama department run by Janet Bayliss, and Krista knew that we had really good teaching there, and they were looking for particular roles, and she came to take a look at us. Really, we pretty much stood in the little dungeon that was the theatre department, and she kind of looked around and she said, okay, you there was a particular look that she was going for in terms of the boys and the girls. And then we were handed some sides, and she said, okay, in a couple of days you're going to come in and you're going to read for this. And I went to the house where she still casts from to this day, and I did my read. And I remember it was just Krista and someone else. I think it was someone operating the camera. And then a few days later, I was called in again to read for a different part, and all the producers were there from America. And I had no idea, so there I am, all, peacocky.
16.
Not a clue. And they were like, they had changed the brief of the character because they liked me. They liked my look. So what was meant to be an Indian character, they created into more of a Mediterranean character. And that I was lucky. Right time, right. If I hadn't been at Crawford, I wouldn't have been seen. It was really right time, right place. And that is so much a part of what we do. It's not a lack of sometimes you're just not in the right place at the right time.
Mom, Dad, can I go on location? I'm 16 and these are the people I'm going to do it with. That must have been quite a conversation.
It was. Thankfully, my father was a very big fan of Kim Basinger. And, but also, I fought pretty hard. I mean, I was pretty scrappy. I was pretty impossible, petulant even perhaps. But, there were coaches and teachers who came with us. There were, Krista, it was Krista who actually, created a sense of like everything's going to be just fine. They will be taken care of. And I have met one of my best friends in the whole world. I met on that set. So it's just it was. I think they would have been scared to have said no. I think part of them when I got back and I said I'm gonna be an actor for the rest of my life. I think they were like, "What do you mean? You wanted to go into medicine? What do you mean?" I was like, "I will play a doctor." And but that was a much bigger fight to actually study drama as opposed to having just the experience of being on a movie set with film stars.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing about being on a movie set with a film star is it's much more glamorous and there's a lot more to it than there is television. But TV is obviously a lot more secure work. So it must be quite an interesting duality that sometimes, yes, someone can be on set for a film that is I have no idea. I presume good pay.
It depends on this. It depends on the set. It depends on the production. It depends on the amount of money, because I've been on a number of film sets and they are not all created equal.
Sure.
And same as TV. I've done quite a bit of international television, and it's from a very basic thing, just from food, from catering, and seating and space, trailers, rooms to change in, as opposed to changing into quick pop-up tents. But the point is that it doesn't matter. You're still doing what you love, and you're just moving through it, and you just roll with it. Because if you're doing a job that you really are just so in love with, you'll walk over shards of glass for it, really.
No, sure. And I mean, that also means sometimes that people who, so money is the motivation, but it's not the only motivation. Does that mean sometimes you have to pick and choose between money and the art? You want to do this?
Sometimes there are the money jobs, and those are usually invariably commercials. But when it comes down, and I've worked this way my whole life, and it was something that my first agent impressed upon me at a very, very young age, the late Vuyo Lee, and she said to me, if it doesn't resonate with you, don't say yes. Doesn't matter how broke you are, which is a very scary reality. And I've been very, I don't know, how do I say this? I've held onto that. I've let that govern the films and the television that I've wanted to explore. But the money jobs are definitely, okay, I'm going to go for this casting. And for the most part, sometimes you walk into the room and there are, 5'11", beautiful women, and you feel like a hobbit. And you think, why am I here? This is terrible. But it did say on the brief, need actors who can act.
Yes.
And you're like, okay, but I can do that,
And not everyone can.
No, not everyone can.
Yeah. How important is an agent in your line of work?
It's very important. Firstly, they're going to negotiate in a very different way. They're a wonderful barrier to protect you. And that's where the access comes from. So when your casting directors and your casting agents are sending in briefs, that's the means for it to get to you. These casting agents and directors, they're not going to have your email on file. They're sending it to agents, and then they'll look through the briefs and they'll go, okay, we think that Shannon would be, or whatever actor or actress would be very good for this fit, and then they resubmit back. So they're advocating for you in a way that I don't like that end of it. I'm only interested in the creative aspect of it. I don't want to talk. I actually don't want to talk money. I'm like, Jerry, you do it. That you release the Kraken, off you go, love you, bye.
Come back to me with an offer. We're speaking to Shannon Ezra tonight, from Linus, many other things, of course, over the course of a moderately long career. If I'd said very long, you would have thrown something at
me.
You would have thrown something at me if I'd said very long.
No, it's absolutely fine. I have no problem with my age at all.
10 minutes now to 8 o'clock.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025.
Speaking to Shannon Ezra, the actress, this evening. You'll know if you spent any time watching a small screen, you'll have come across Shannon. Shannon, okay, so over the course of a career, is there one thing or anything that you think would have made or could still make things easier financially? Any law in particular that's holding things back, or something that you think would actually change your industry and help people in your game?
I mean, absolutely. If we could pass the Performers Protection Amendment Bill, and if we could pass the Copyright Amendment Bill, that would absolutely transform the creative sector as we know it. We have no regulation whatsoever. And in fact, SAGA, the South African Guild of Actors, we are going to the Court. We're going to the Constitutional Court on the 19th and 20th of March to try and argue these bills into law, so that we can, we can have the statutory right to earn royalties, and hopefully build the framework which would aid in collecting and distributing them. It would, and this would also, if we were granted the right to earn royalties for our work, for film and television specifically, we would be able to create an annuity income. It would also enable us to as freelancers, we don't have monthly incomes. And service providers, banking institutions for home loans or car financing, it's very difficult to try and assess that you can afford something when you don't have it showing up on a monthly statement. So it makes it very, very difficult for us to have, access to those things. I think that, I also think that, well, actually, I know this, but if this were to happen, if these bills were passed into law, it would not only empower the creative sector, it would empower actors, it would allow our agents, or if you are without agent, it would allow for fair negotiation, it will allow for due processing, it would create a different stability within our industry. It's a global standard practice to receive residuals for work that you've done and to not be able to receive residuals for a body of work, which, it's like I said, it's a global standard practice, and we're actually falling behind Africa. Nigeria and Kenya are following these practices now. So it's quite scary, and I'm really hoping that we can have the favorable outcome that we all want. And I also think it will increase even for investors filming here. We have the most incredible country in the world. We have such dynamic landscapes. We have, it would just, the return of investment for investors. It'll make it a lot more appealing because we'll go from one regulated region to another. You look at how much is shot in Australia, in New Zealand, all around the world, and there's this. It creates an uncertainty for investors, and I think it would just help everybody. And musicians have had royalties. I was going to say
that's how it
60
works
years.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, they have a body that does it, and we haven't. And this has been, a process already. We're 7 years in. We're still trying to get these bills passed. So hopefully Parliament will agree, and they'll change. They will change the lives of actors. They really, really will.
And at no cost to Parliament. At cost to the industry. It'll change the way it works. It'll change the balance of power in the right way.
Yes, I agree. And I'm hoping with all my heart and my soul that happens, because we've got too many actors, too many who they can't afford medical insurance. It's dire.
You've met Jack Devnerin, of course.
Jackie D's my boy. I have so much love and respect for Jack.
Didn't you work together on a soap? What was it called? It was about dogs. Oh, It's a Dingo.
It's a dingo. Oh, Dingo got my baby. Yeah. No, Jackie. Yeah, he is one of my. I'm very blessed to call him not only just a colleague but a very good friend, and as the chairman of SAGA. His steadfast, unwavering commitment to our causes, I find it completely admirable, and I'm in awe. I'm in awe of the people that are sitting there pushing this through.
You, I remember driving into Sandton a while ago, and literally there's Shannon, there's Shannon.
Oh, yeah, the line is.
There's Shannon Ezra. Yes,
it was really intense for me.
Quite strange in a way.
It's very strange. I even remember when I did Snitch back in 2004, and the billboards were on Stephen Finnekirk and I. And even then I was like, what is happening? But it was just the one on what was William Nicol and now,
Did anyone meet you at a party and say, I know you from somewhere, and not be able to place it?
Not then so much, but now it's, there's also a bigger body of work to reference.
Yes, of course. It's different.
I quite enjoy it when people are like, oh, hi, how are you? And I'm like, I'm good. And then my best friend will say, do you know that person? I'm like, no idea. No. And then you watch the eyes as they click into, oh, that's the chick from...
That's the person.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love it, though. It's a lovely part of what we do.
You were 16 in a school room. Someone was picking you up almost out of a lineup. You ended up doing...
Almost like a criminal, yeah.
And you've been doing it for a long time since then.
Yes.
Any regrets?
Any regrets? None.
Really? You're glad you did it?
Stephen, if I hadn't done it, that would have been the biggest regret. And I wouldn't be the person I am. I think I would be very depressed. No, it was really a deep, deep calling. And I would have lied to myself. I don't think we can live a life in deception. When something really just
Yeah.
You know,
So acting's called you in a way.
in every way. Goodness knows I have cried in puddles wishing that I had some other interest that called to me just as loudly, because there are times when it is incredibly hard. But that is not my fate.
Yeah. Like actuarial science never called me.
You know, why?
Shannon Ezra, thank you. Great to
Stephen
see you
Curtis,
again.
thank you. Very
nice
lovely
to talk
to
to
see
you.
you.
Very much.
Lovely
Really
to
do
talk to
appreciate
you.
it. Shannon Ezra with you on My Money on The Money Show.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025.
What Donald Trump did next? Well, we'll find out together on The Money Show tomorrow night. There will be a lot more to come. I would watch steel prices very, very closely. The gold price shooting the lights out again today, going past $2,900 an ounce for the first time. A reminder once again that just when you think we're no longer a mining town, it's probably the reason the JSE is up, even though we're in the firing line of the person in the White House. Back tomorrow. Good evening, 8 o'clock.